A royal guard was walking to his post when he spotted something that made his blood run cold. A little blind girl standing alone at the edge of busy London traffic. Her mother was nowhere to be seen. But what happened next when that child stepped into the road changed everything. What the guard saw bearing down on her made him drop his ceremonial hat and run like his life depended on it. Before we tell you what he discovered, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The morning mist hung over Constitution Hill like smoke from a dying fire, turning the grand stone façades around Buckingham Palace into ghostly shadows. It was that particular London quiet, not silence, but the hushed reverence that comes before ceremony begins. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Corporal Lewis Finch walked toward his post with the measured pace of a man who'd learned that being early wasn't courtesy, it was survival. His black leather boots struck the pavement in perfect rhythm, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the gray sky above. His bearskin hat tucked under one arm, dress gloves folded precisely in the other. Every detail of his appearance was regulation perfect. But underneath that ceremonial perfection was something tourists never saw. 36 years old, Grenadier Guards, with 11 years of active service behind him, 2 tours in Helmand Province, a military cross for gallantry after he'd held a forward position alone for 6 hours, while his squad evacuated casualties under sniper fire. The kind of soldier who'd learned to read danger in the smallest details. A flash of sunlight off glass, footsteps that fell just slightly off rhythm, shadows that moved when they shouldn't. Those instincts had saved his life more times than he cared to count. The way a shadow fell wrong across a doorway in Kandahar. The sound of footsteps that didn't quite match the rhythm of a patrol. The particular quality of silence that meant someone was holding their breath, waiting to strike. His body had learned to read danger, the way other people read road signs, automatically, constantly, without conscious thought. To the early morning tourists already gathering behind the palace railings, he was just another ceremonial guard, part of the pageantry, a living statue in red wool and bearskin. They saw the polished brass buttons and perfectly pressed uniform, the theatrical stillness that made for perfect photographs. They had no idea they were looking at a man who'd once held off 30 Taliban fighters for 6 hours, with nothing but a rifle and sheer bloody-minded determination. A man who'd carried a wounded comrade to miles through hostile territory under mortar fire. A man trained to kill with his bare hands if necessary, but who'd rather talk his way out of trouble than fight his way through it. Finch liked these quiet moments before duty began, when London was still civilized, before the crowds and cameras turned everything into theater. He passed the outer checkpoint with a brief nod to the constable on duty. No words needed between professionals. His eyes automatically scanned the street ahead, cataloging every detail with the systematic precision that had kept him alive in places where a moment's inattention meant death. A white tour bus discharged its load of sleepy German tourists near the main gates. Early morning joggers puffed past in expensive athletic gear. Palace staff in fluorescent vests began setting up crowd barriers, with the weary efficiency of people who did this same dance every single day. Normal routine. Safe. Then something at the edge of his vision shattered that normality like glass, hitting concrete. A child standing alone at the curb on Marlborough Road. Finch slowed, his soldier's instinct screaming that something was wrong. The girl couldn't have been more than 7 years old, dressed in a soft purple raincoat that hung loose around her small frame. Her dark hair was pulled into 2 uneven pigtails, white ribbons fluttering in the morning breeze. In her right hand she gripped a white cane. She was blind, and she was completely alone. But that wasn't what made Finch's pulse quicken. It was her posture. She stood at the very edge of the curb, not safely back on the pavement, her body angled toward the road like she was preparing to cross. Her cane tapped hesitantly against the edge of the street, once, twice, then hovered in mid-air, as if she couldn't decide what came next. The rhythm was all wrong. Finch had watched enough confident blind pedestrians navigate London streets to recognize the difference. This child wasn't moving with purpose or familiarity. She was hesitating in that particular way that meant she was lost, confused, trying to make sense of a world that suddenly didn't match her expectations. Her head tilted slightly as a bus rumbled past, then turned to the other direction as footsteps echoed from the opposite pavement. She was trying to orient herself using sound, but the urban noise was clearly overwhelming her. Too many inputs, too many variables, too much chaos for a child's mind to process. Finch's eyes swept the area, searching for an adult, a guardian. Anyone who might be responsible for this child. Across the street near the palace, at the security kiosk, he spotted a woman in a navy trench coat, mid-30s, well-dressed, animated in conversation with a palace staffer. One hand held a phone to her ear. The other gestured as she spoke, completely absorbed in whatever crisis required her immediate attention. From this distance, Finch could catch fragments of her conversation carried on the morning breeze. Absolutely cannot reschedule the Tokyo call. Client is threatening to pull the entire account. I don't care what time it is there. She never once looked back toward the road. Never once checked on the child who should have been beside her. Finch felt a familiar anger rise in his chest. Not the hot fury of combat, but the cold disappointment he'd learned to recognize in civilian life. How many times had he seen this? Parents so absorbed in their phones, their jobs, their urgent crises that they forgot the most important job of all, watching their children die in Afghanistan. A moment's inattention meant someone died. Here in peaceful London, people had forgotten that danger doesn't announce itself with sirens and warnings. The girl's cane tapped the curb again, more decisively this time. Her small foot shifted forward, toe brushing the edge of the street. Every alarm bell Finch had developed over 11 years of military service started screaming at once. Traffic moved steadily through the intersection, not heavy, but consistent. A black cab rolled past. Two cyclists pedaled by in the bike lane. The morning commute was beginning, and drivers had places to be. In a city like London, pedestrians were expected to follow the rules, use the crossings, wait for lights. A blind 7-year-old standing alone at the curb wasn't following any rules at all. Finch took a step forward. Still 20 meters away, his ceremonial hat shifting under his arm. He could call out, but would she hear him over the traffic? Would she understand that a stranger's voice meant help, not danger? The girl's cane swept once more across the curb's edge. Then she lifted her foot, one step into the street. Finch's training kicked in like muscle memory. His stride lengthened, closing distance fast, but trying not to alarm her. "Excuse me, miss," he called, keeping his voice calm but clear. "Please wait there." The child didn't respond. Either she couldn't hear him over the ambient noise, or she was too focused on the overwhelming task of trying to navigate alone through a city designed for sighted adults. She took another step forward, deeper into the road. A cyclist swerved around her, calling out in annoyance, "Watch where you're going." The man clearly hadn't noticed the white cane, hadn't realized he'd just shouted at a blind child for not seeing him coming. Emma flinched at the harsh voice, her small body tensing. But instead of stepping back to safety, she froze completely. The worst possible response in the middle of a London street. Her cane trembled in her grip as traffic continued to flow around her. Finch's military training kicked into overdrive. In combat, you learn to recognize the moment when a situation shifted from manageable to critical. This was that moment. The child was now a static obstacle in moving traffic, confused and frightened, with no idea which direction led to safety. That's when Finch saw the truck, 2 blocks up, moving too fast for the narrow street. A large white delivery vehicle with faded company logos bearing down on the intersection. With no sign of slowing. Something about its trajectory was wrong, too straight, too unwavering. Like the driver wasn't making the tiny corrections that conscious drivers make every few seconds. Finch's eyes narrowed, his combat-trained brain automatically calculating speed, distance, and angles. The truck was doing at least 40 in what should have been a 30 zone. No brake lights, no indication of stopping for the upcoming traffic signal, and the path was laser straight, like it was following GPS coordinates rather than responding to the fluid reality of London traffic. Most people would have dismissed it as just another impatient delivery driver running late. But Finch had learned to trust the feeling that crawled up his spine when something didn't fit the pattern. In Afghanistan, that feeling had kept him alive when IEDs were buried in roads that looked perfectly normal. Here, that same instinct was telling him that truck was about to become a weapon. His stomach dropped as the pieces came together. The truck was approaching at roughly 40 miles per hour. The girl was now 2 steps into the street, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who couldn't see what was coming. The traffic light would change in maybe 30 seconds, releasing cars from both directions into the intersection. She was going to be caught directly in the path, and from this distance, Finch could see through the windscreen well enough to confirm his worst fears. The driver's silhouette was wrong, slumped too far forward, too still, like a puppet with cut strings. He dropped his bearskin hat and ran. Finch's boots hammered against the tarmac as he sprinted toward the intersection. his dress uniform forgotten, protocol abandoned. The girl had taken another step forward, her cane sweeping across the painted white stripes of the crossing. She was halfway into the road now, moving with heartbreaking trust that the world around her was safe. "Miss," Finch shouted, louder now, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "Stop, don't move this time." She heard him. Her small body went rigid, cane extended in front of her like an antenna searching for signals she couldn't interpret. But she didn't step backward. She just froze there, directly in the path of oncoming traffic. The truck was 1 block away now, close enough for Finch to see through the windscreen. What he saw made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. The driver was slumped forward over the steering wheel, motionless, his head lolled to one side, mouth slack, arms hanging limp. The truck was a two-ton missile with no one conscious to control it, bearing down on a child who had no idea death was racing toward her at 40 miles per hour. Finch ran harder than he'd ever run in his life, lungs burning, legs pumping with the desperate strength that comes only when someone else's life hangs in the balance. The girl stood frozen in the middle of the road, her purple raincoat bright against the gray asphalt, a tiny figure about to be erased from existence. 20 meters, 15, 10. The truck's engine roared as it closed the final distance, its unconscious driver's foot heavy on the accelerator. Finch reached the girl with seconds to spare. Without breaking stride, he wrapped both arms round her small waist and lifted her clean off her feet, throwing his full weight backward as the truck thundered past them. The massive vehicle missed them by inches, so close that Finch felt the rush of displaced air across his face, so close that the truck's side mirror nearly clipped his shoulder. He landed hard on the pavement with the girl clutched against his chest, his body absorbing the impact as they rolled clear of the road. Behind them, tires screamed against asphalt, metal shrieked, glass exploded. The truck, with its unconscious driver, had slammed full speed into the scaffolding of a building under renovation. The crash echoed off the surrounding stone facadas like thunder, followed by the peculiar silence that always follows sudden violence. Finch lay on the sidewalk, chest heaving, the girl still wrapped safely in his arms. She was breathing, fast, shallow breaths that spoke of confusion rather than injury. Her white cane had skittered away across the pavement, but she was alive, whole, unharmed. For a moment, the world felt suspended in cotton wool. The usual sounds of London traffic seemed muffled and distant. A few tourists stood frozen behind their phones, mouths open, still processing what they'd just witnessed. Someone was crying, a woman who'd been walking her dog and had seen the whole thing unfold. The girl in his arms stirred slightly, her small hands gripping the wool of his tunic. "What happened?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the settling debris. "There was a big noise." "You're safe," Finch murmured, his voice rougher than he intended. "Just a lorry had some trouble. But you're completely safe now, across the street." The woman in the navy coat screamed. She'd finally looked up from her phone call, finally seen what her distraction had nearly cost. She ran toward them, heels clicking frantically against the pavement, her face white with shock and something close to hysteria. Oh God, what happened, Emma? Emma, are you hurt?" She dropped to her knees beside them, hands fluttering over her daughter like she was afraid to touch her, afraid that contact might confirm some invisible injury. Finch sat up slowly, still cradling the child. "She's fine," he said quietly, studying the mother's face. "She's not injured, just shaken up." The woman, Sarah, she'd later introduce herself, looked like she was about to collapse. Her phone lay forgotten on the pavement where she'd dropped it. The screen cracked, but still glowing with an unfinished work call. Her hands shook as she reached for her daughter, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I was only on the phone for a minute," she choked out. "Just one work call. I thought she was right behind me. I thought, oh God, what if you hadn't been here? What if?" But even as she spoke those words, Finch's eyes were already fixed on the wreckage across the street. The truck's front end was buried in twisted scaffolding, steam rising from the crushed radiator, and in the cab, visible through the spider-webbed windscreen, the driver still wasn't moving. There was work still to be done. Finch gently transferred the girl to her mother's arms and stood. His dress uniform was torn at the knee. Dust and grime streaked across the scarlet wool. His ceremonial gloves were split where his hands had hit the pavement. Without a word, he ran toward the wreck. The delivery truck looked like it had been stepped on by a giant. The entire front end was accordioned against the building's scaffolding. Metal supports twisted into abstract sculpture. The windscreen was a constellation of cracks radiating out from where the driver's head had struck it. Steam and the acrid smell of radiator fluid filled the air. Finch reached the driver's door and yanked it open, his heart hammering. The man behind the wheel was in his 40s, wearing a company uniform with a name tag that read Bryant. His face was gray, lips tinged blue, eyes rolled back and unseeing. No pulse, no breathing, no response to touch or voice. Finch had seen enough dead men to recognize one immediately. This wasn't a man injured in a crash. This was a man who died before the crash, probably from a massive heart attack or stroke. His foot had stayed pressed on the accelerator even as life left his body, turning his delivery truck into an unguided missile. Behind him, voices rose from the gathering crowd. "Is he all right? Someone called. Someone call an ambulance," shouted another. But Finch was already moving, already thinking 3 steps ahead, the way soldiers learn to do when time becomes a luxury you can't afford. He climbed into the cab and felt for a pulse one more time, pressing harder, checking different spots on the man's neck and wrist. Sometimes shock could mask vital signs, sometimes nothing. The skin was already cooling. Finch backed out of the cab and turned to address the crowd that had formed. His voice carried the authority that comes from years of speaking to soldiers in crisis situations. "I need everyone to step back 20 meters. This is now a crime scene until police determine otherwise." The driver appears to have suffered a medical emergency while operating the vehicle. A woman in a business suit stepped forward. "Are you a doctor?" "Former military medic," Finch replied. A small lie, but one that would prevent arguments and questions he didn't have time for. "The man is deceased. Emergency services are en route. But right now we need to secure the area and check for other casualties." The crowd began to move back, that particular kind of reluctant compliance civilians show when someone with obvious authority takes charge. A palace security officer approached, slightly out of breath. "Corporal, are you injured, sir?" Finch shook his head, stepping back from the wreckage. "Driver's deceased. Looks like medical emergency before impact." His voice was steady, professional, but his hands were shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. The officer nodded grimly, and the child, safe, that was all that mattered. 20 minutes later, after the paramedics had confirmed what Finch already knew, after the police had cordoned off the scene and begun taking statements, after the crowd had been moved back to a safe distance, Finch found himself standing beside the little girl and her mother again. The woman, Sarah, she'd introduced herself, couldn't stop apologizing, to him, to her daughter, to the police officers, to anyone who would listen. "I turned away for 30 seconds. She kept saying, just 30 seconds to take a work call. I thought she was right behind me. I thought she was safe, but it wasn't just guilt driving her." Words. It was the slow dawning realization of what those 30 seconds had almost cost. Finch had seen this before, in the families of soldiers who'd made one small mistake that nearly proved fatal. The way shock transforms into self-recrimination. The endless loop of what if that threatens to consume people. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said quietly, using her surname to add gravity to his words, "your daughter is safe. That's what matters now. But I need you to understand something." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes red with tears. This wasn't an accident waiting to happen. This was a specific failure of attention that almost had tragic consequences. "Emma can't see the world around her. She depends entirely on you to be her eyes. When you're distracted, she's not just alone, she's blind and alone." The words were harsh, but they needed to be said. In the military, you learned that kind honesty could save lives, while comfortable lies got people killed. Sarah's face crumpled. I know, I failed her. Work is so demanding, and the phone never stops ringing. And I thought, just once. There is no just once when you're responsible for someone else's life. Finch interrupted. There's only always watching or not watching, and not watching has consequences. The little girl, Emma, sat quietly on a low concrete barrier, her recovered white cane resting across her knees. She hadn't said much since the incident, but her small fingers kept tracing patterns in the air as if she were trying to map out what had happened in a world she experienced only through sound and touch. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful in the way that only children can manage after surviving something they don't fully understand. "Mommy, why did the man in the truck go to sleep while he was driving?" Sarah's breath caught. She'd been dreading this question, knowing it would come, but hoping she'd have more time to prepare an answer that wouldn't give her daughter nightmares. Finch knelt down beside her, careful to announce his presence. "Emma, I'm Corporal Finch. How are you feeling?" She turned her face toward his voice, head tilted slightly in that particular way blind people do when they're using hearing to paint a picture of someone. "The truck was very loud," she said matter-of-factly, and then everything went quiet for a moment. "Was someone hurt?" Finch glanced at her mother, who nodded tearfully. There was no point in lying to a child who would hear it on the news anyway, and Emma was clearly smart enough to understand that something serious had happened. "Yes," he said gently. "The man driving the truck got very sick, very suddenly, and his heart stopped working. That's why he couldn't control the truck anymore. But he didn't suffer, and he didn't know what was happening. And most importantly, you're safe." Emma nodded solemnly, processing this information with the straightforward acceptance that children often show toward life's darker truths. "Mommy says you're a soldier." "I am." "Do soldiers always run that fast, despite everything?" The torn uniform, the ache in his ribs from hitting the pavement, the image of that lifeless truck driver burned into his memory. Finch almost smiled. "Only when it matters." "It mattered today." "Yes," he said simply. "It did." A palace staffer approached with a wheelchair, standard procedure for anyone involved in a traffic incident, regardless of apparent injuries. But Emma shook her head firmly. "I can walk," she said with quiet dignity. "I just need to hold someone's hand." Sarah immediately reached for her daughter, but Emma turned slightly toward Finch. "Would you walk with us to the car? I feel safer with you." Finch looked at the torn knee of his dress uniform, the grime on his hands, the bearskin hat that lay abandoned somewhere behind them. He was supposed to be on duty in 20 minutes, standing perfectly still at his ceremonial post, while tourists took photographs. Instead, he offered his hand to a 7-year-old girl who just learned that the world was more dangerous than she'd imagined, but also discovered that sometimes strangers run toward danger to keep children safe. "Of course," he said. They walked slowly toward the palace car park where Sarah's vehicle waited, Emma's small hand in his large one, her white cane tapping confidently now that she had someone she trusted to guide her. Behind them, workers were already beginning to clear the wreckage, return the street to normal, erase the evidence of how close tragedy had come. At the car, Emma turned to face him one more time. "Will you still be a guard tomorrow every day?" Finch replied. "Good," she said seriously. "Someone should watch for people who need help." As their car pulled away, Finch stood alone in the morning mist, his uniform torn, his hat lost, his perfectly planned morning in ruins. A superior officer would probably question his actions. There would be paperwork to file, reports to write, explanations to give about why he'd abandoned his post to chase after a civilian child. The street around him was slowly returning to normal. Workers had arrived to clear the debris and tow the wreckage. Police tape fluttered in the breeze, cordoning off what was now just another traffic incident to be processed and forgotten. By evening, there would be no sign that anything unusual had happened here, just another intersection where people crossed safely because they trusted that others were paying attention. But Finch would remember. He'd remember the weight of that small body in his arms, the trust in a child's voice when she asked him to walk with her to the car. He'd remember the sound of her mother's sobs when the reality hit her, how close she'd come to losing everything that mattered because of 30 seconds of distraction. Most of all, he'd remember the lesson that the army had taught him years ago, but that civilian life sometimes made easy to forget. That being strong isn't about what you can do for yourself. It's about what you're willing to do for someone who can't protect themselves. As he watched that car disappear into London traffic, carrying a little girl who was alive because one soldier had refused to look away when everyone else was distracted, Corporal Lewis Finch felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Pride, not in the uniform, or the ceremony, or the tradition, but in the simple act of being exactly where he was needed, exactly when it mattered most. The tourists at the palace gates would never know what they'd missed. They'd see a guard in a slightly rumpled uniform and assume he'd had a clumsy morning. They'd take their photos and move on, never realizing they were looking at a man who'd just saved a life before most of London had finished their morning coffee. And that was fine with him. The best victories, he'd learned, were the ones nobody ever heard about. He retrieved his battered bearskin hat from the road, brushed it off, and walked toward the palace gates. His shift was starting soon, and tourists would be expecting their perfectly still, silent guardian. They had no idea they were about to see a man who just saved a life before breakfast. "Here's what we want to know. Would you have noticed that little girl if her mother hadn't been watching? How often do we assume someone else is taking care of the people who need protection?" And when you see a royal guard standing at his post, will you remember that beneath that ceremonial uniform stands a soldier trained to act when seconds matter? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Every one of your responses helps us understand what these stories mean to you. If this story changed how you think about the men and women who guard our traditions, hit that like button and subscribe. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a story that reminds us why service matters. Share this with someone who needs to remember that real heroes don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they just show up, exactly when hope is running out. Your next Royal Guard story is waiting on your screen right now. Click it, and we'll see you tomorrow with another reminder that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about acting when someone needs you to, even if you're scared. Same time, same place. We'll be here.